for this unit, I thought I would go over how the scientific method was important in figuring out that cholera was a waterborne disease, specifically in what Dr. John Snow found out from the Broad Street cholera epidemic. So here's an overview of what we're going to be covering in this presentation. A review of the scientific method. We're going to talk about the marasma theory, which was covered in Chapter 5 of the Ghost Map. We're going to talk about how they used the scientific method to validate, at the time, the marasma theory. We're going to talk about the germ theory, how the scientific method was able to validate the germ theory. Then we're going to talk about specifically the Broad Street cholera epidemic and how Dr. Snow used the scientific method. And then we're going to talk about not judging the past. So real quick, let's go over the scientific method and the steps thereof. First, you make an observation, which usually is very quickly followed by a question, which leads to a hypothesis, or a statement of the question that is testable. Then you set up an experiment to test your hypothesis. Then you analyze the results of the test, and then you ask yourself, was the hypothesis supported? At the time of John Snow, there were two competing theories about what causes disease. There was the marasma theory versus the newer radical germ theory. So I'm going to go over both of them and basically state what the theories were. And we will talk about how the scientific method was used to support or to not support these two theories. So, in a nutshell, the marasma theory is that when you have stinky things, those stinky things will cause you to be ill. I have feces here because that's what was the main focus of the Ghost Map, but it could be any bad smells. So, for example, if you were to stay overnight in the swamp, which smells bad, then you would get sick. Or if you left your windows open at night, you would get sick because of the evil smells, the evil air that was coming in. Let's talk about how the scientific method was used to support the marasma theory in the Ghost Map. So there were a lot of feces, animal and human, in London at the time, and in fact in all big cities. You had the feces problem in other areas, in the rural areas, but it was easier to get rid of. You tilled it into your garden, basically. And so fewer people were getting sick. So the observation that we have more feces laying around being stinky and fewer people getting sick led to the hypothesis, or the question, of if you get rid of the smell, then you're going to get rid of people getting sick. So what they did in London is they flushed all of this into the river. And you weren't disgusted by the bad smells in that area anymore. Sewers are a great thing. Cholera cases were still present and they were still increasing, so they worked on improving the sewers, with the idea being you get rid of the bad smells, and the source of the bad smells, you'll get rid of people getting sick. At about the same time period, there was a radical new theory that was being developed, and people were performing experiments to either discredit it or to support this idea that it wasn't the smell coming from the feces or from the swamp, but it was germs or small organisms, small living organisms, that were then causing illness. Well, part of what was being discussed is whether these were spontaneously arising or whether they were actual living organisms that could reproduce and go on and cause more of themselves. One of the famous experiments that validated the germ theory and brought it to the forefront and eventually displaced the marasma theory was an experiment that Louis Pasteur had performed, where he would take beef broth, pour it into a flask, and then boil it after he had made this lovely swan neck on his flask. So he boiled it, air is forced out the end, and we now know that this was sterilized, killing all of the microbes inside. because of the bend in the flask, dust would get caught in it. Now, why did he do that instead of just sealing it off? Part of the competing theory was that if you boiled it in a closed flask, then air wouldn't get in, and air was necessary for things to live and grow. Makes sense. If you cut off people from air, they die. So this allowed air to get in, but it caught the dust, which we now know was full of microbes. So here for a long time, by the way, we still have some of Louis Pasteur's original swan neck flasks that are still sterile in a museum in Paris, I believe. And it would remain sterile indefinitely. But if you were to tip it and get dust in it and then tip it upright after a short time, you get microorganisms growing in the liquid. So this helped support the germ theory. So let's go over how Dr. John Snow used the scientific method, using the information that you read in the ghost map, to figure out that cholera was a waterborne, and still is, a waterborne disease. So first he made the observation, and Dr. Snow worked with ether and with chloroform, and so he was well aware of, we'll call it stinky air. And he made the observation that cholera did not follow the wind patterns. And so he came up with the question of, is cholera being spread by some other method? So he came up with the hypothesis that it was waterborne. So in previous epidemics, before the Broad Street epidemic, he had gathered data, but he gathered data especially during the Broad Street epidemic because it was so virulent and so fast and so concentrated. And he gathered data, along with the help of other people in the area, and he analyzed the data. So the data that he gathered and analyzed was who was sick and who was not sick and where they lived. And he found that the cases of cholera were centered around the Broad Street pump. Now you're going, well, there's clear over here and clear over here and clear over here. Well, if you look, you follow the streets, this is the best way to get to water. Whereas maybe the water is closer here, but see, there's no street. So he had his observation, his question, formulated a hypothesis, gathered data, analyzed the data. The analysis of the data supported his hypothesis that cholera was waterborne, that it had been coming from the Broad Street water pump. And that in itself supported the germ theory. Now, as you know, we go with the germ theory right now. But I want to warn you against judging the past, whether in fashions and hairstyles or in what are considered mistakes of the past, because who knows what mistakes of thought and which theories will be disproven in the future. So be kind to your ancestors. They were doing the best that they could. And be aware that we have paradigm shifts as new data is collected that does not support the current theory, and so we have to come up with a new hypothesis. And once that hypothesis is supported by a lot of experimental evidence, by a lot of data, then we go with that new theory. So the microbiome is one of those things. It used to be that we had a lot of evidence to support that all germs were bad. Well, now we're collecting more data that was harder to get when we didn't have the techniques that we have now. And we are now learning that not all germs are bad, not all germs cause disease, and it's far more complicated than in the case of true pathogens that always cause disease, where you have some that cause disease sometimes and some that cause disease, that don't cause disease at other times, and then you have some that cause health. But let me tell you, health is harder to pin down than disease is. So I hope this helps you understand the material that we're covering this week and give you another example of how the scientific method works.